Hey everybody, welcome to CAF Warbird Tube, the show where we talk about World War II, aviation, history, and so much more. Warbird Tube is produced by the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying museum. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences. The CAF began the Warbird movement more than 65 years ago, and thanks to the support of individuals like you, we continue to grow strong. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and now our host, Steve Buss. Thanks for watching and keep 'em flying.
Good evening and welcome to CAF Warbird Tube. This is episode number 142 of Warbird Tube, and tonight we continue our series on shows focusing on CAF's annual fundraiser, the 12 Planes of Christmas. This week, the Stinson L-5 from the CAF FloriBama Wing. But before we get started, please do us a favor. If you haven't already done so, take a second to like, share, or subscribe, and follow us. And if you do subscribe on YouTube, click on that bell icon to get notifications about new episodes of Warbird Tube when they are posted. Of course, Warbird Tube is made possible by the Commemorative Air Force. To find out more about the CAF, our events, our aircraft, local units, or how you can join the fun, just visit our website, commemorativeairforce.org. Now, joining us from the FloriBama Wing is Colonel Rick Bell. And Rick, pleased to have you with us tonight.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's nice to be here, Steve. I'm glad to be discussing some of our aircraft here in the CAF.
Well, excellent. Tell us a little bit about your background with the Commemorative Air Force.
I joined the CAF as I'm actually a pilot, and I was walking through the terminal in LaGuardia Airport one time, and I had heard of the CAF, but this is pre-real internet. And I found an application for the CAF sitting on a chair in a gate and filled it out, and that's how I joined. And I decided to go to a air show down in Harlingen, and I happened to get on the airplane with a gentleman from Alabama. And of course, since I'm from Florida and he's from Alabama, we immediately joined the unit from Oakland because that seemed to make a lot of sense for some reason. And I've been a member ever since then. For quite a few years, we did not have a unit in Florida. So, and me being up in the Panhandle, even when the Florida Wing started, it was not close to where I was. So I've been just going to wherever headquarters was in that year and going to air shows and trying to assist in whatever we had going on.
That's great. How many different CAF aircraft have you flown in your tenure?
Well, some I've pilot sponsored just to help them with the cost. But I've flown the B-29, the B-24, T-6. I've flown, been involved with the Hawker Sea Fury, the T-33. We've just acquired a Pinto jet, and I'm helping them get that up and running. And a Stearman and a few others. I've just been lucky in being able to do that.
Excellent. Well, tonight we're going to talk about something that doesn't quite go as fast as the B-29 or a Pinto jet or a T-33. It's the Stinson L-5 that's been assigned to the FloriBama Wing. And again, we're here tonight to try to raise a little money and help spruce up that airplane a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about it.
Well, first, I just want to say a few things about the L-5. There's another L-5 in the 12 Planes of Christmas. We operate quite a few. They're very, very important aircraft. They operate in every theater of the war. Liaison aircrafts are not real exciting, but they're very, very important. They were built from 42 to 45. They built about almost 3,600 of them. It was designed, unlike most liaison aircraft, like from Piper or Taylorcraft, that were adapted from a civilian version. This airplane was built just for the military. Now, the first versions, and as they continued on, some were set up for stretchers and some were not. Our particular one was not set up for a stretcher, but the B versions and some were modified to go into stretchers. It was widely used. They even have tried a float plane version of it, and a couple of places they tried skis. There's a picture of the float plane version. That never really, we acquired bases fast enough that despite this airplane and even an airplane from the F-4F called the Wild Catfish, they just didn't need the float planes because we acquired the bases from the Japanese rapidly enough to do that. But that's about all I'm going to go into about, because most people know the history of the L-5, and you'll have other people talk about that, and we have before on Warbird too. But that's kind of the flying Jeep is what they called it. The Sentinel was the official name given to it.
What engine was on those?
It's a 435. They're getting a little bit rare with parts. Fortunately, the CF operating a lot. Our ops department is doing a fine job and helping us with different things to do that. It seems to run well. It's just a low maintenance airplane, especially as far as the military and unimproved fields was concerned. So one thing I did want to talk about with the L-5 was a little bit about our airplane. So just so you know how these airplanes and why this one may have survived. Ours was delivered to the armed forces in May of 1943. It was assigned to, in World War II, it was assigned to 6 different units. And between that time and 1948 or 49, it went to 9 other units. So it was everywhere, including all over Louisiana, some in North Carolina, some in other places. It was delivered to the Coast Guard in 1959. The Coast Guard, among other things, used it for tracking bootleggers when they would fly around. The unfortunate thing was, of course, that's where stock car racing started, was some of the bootleggers were faster than the L5s. So, but they did their best to try to track those. Then it was put on the civil registry in 1959. It had 3 owners, and it was donated to the CAF in January of 98. Ended up going to the Old Dominion Squadron. Well, we acquired it in 2019. The Old Dominion Squadron, they kind of aged out their members, and they needed to shut down, and we acquired it from them. So it's a very long, amazing. I think it went to every air base or fort or whatever in Louisiana during the war. So it was just kind of all over the place. So that's kind of the history of our particular airplane. So the unit we're raising money to refinish the outside of the airplane, which would be the 1st Commando unit, which is in the CBI, or the China, Burma, India theater. It's kind of a less well-known theater of operations. In fact, if it were not for the Flying Tigers operating in, obviously, China, most people would not know about the theater. So there was a British colonel, Ord Wingate, and up until I did some research, I kept thinking his name, he was a lord. He was Colonel Lord Wingate. It's Ord, O-R-D-E. So I was confused by this. But anyway, and he was, of course, a typical British, a bit odd. One of the gentlemen, right before the war started, he had been assigned, Wingate, to the China area. And he ended up going down to Burma, where the weather was not so great as far as bugs. And this gentleman wanted to talk to him actually about Palestine. He had been in Palestine. And he knocked on the door with bugs swarming, and Wingate invited him into the house. They sat down, had a 2-hour conversation, and left. And the entire time, the only thing Wingate had on was slippers. He was completely nude other than that. So he was obviously a typical odd gentleman with the British. But he started this stuff they called long-range penetration in Burma. So the Japanese, at the very beginning of the war, like every theater, did quite well in Burma. Burma was just not a good spot to do anything, especially fight a war, because the weather was just miserable there. It had monsoon season, it was mud, it was yuck. They had 12 or 13 different types of poisonous snakes, among other things. But when they got going with these long-range penetration missions, they would go behind enemy lines, and their whole idea was just disrupt, kind of like Commando, as they are, becomes the 1st Commando unit. So they would do this to disrupt the thing. The problem they were having was whenever someone was injured, it was almost impossible to remove them, because they were going into the jungle with pack mules and stuff. But part of that was, as they retreated out of the jungle, that was their food supply. They would eat the pack mules. So the wounded were given a rifle with a clip and a note that said, "These are honorable soldiers," and they could use that to fend off whatever type animal, or if they wanted to shoot at the Japanese, or in their own life. So that was kind of the problem they had. So Admiral Mountbatten and Hap Arnold met with Churchill and President Roosevelt, and they said, what we need is a way to assist this in Burma, because we need to help not the Japanese make it all the way to India. That would have been a problem. So he was using what they called the Chindits, which actually was a misinterpretation of the word Chinith, which is what they were. That describes it's kind of a half lion, half horse mythical creature that guarded their temples. So anyway, they had this conversation, and they got two folks that they really wanted to do it. So one gentleman's name was Philip Cochrane. He was a lieutenant colonel. He had flown in China. He was kind of an ace. They wanted him, and they also wanted another gentleman, John Allison. Now, he was also a member of the Flying Tigers, or the American Volunteer Group. So they got those two guys, and Hap Arnold said, gentlemen, here's an idea. I was thinking about maybe we're going to do this. What do you guys think about running this? Because he was going to have co-command. And they both said, we think this is a terrible idea, or we don't want to run it. And then Hap Arnold explained to him, I was just being polite. That's an order. So then they said, well, okay. So then, of course, what they really wanted was some L1s, because they would carry two stretchers. For whatever reason, despite it being a Stinson product, they were not really available, but the L5 was. So they got the L5s. Well, of course, for two reasons. One is they were kind of hoping Hap would do away with this idea. They kept asking for stuff. And another is, especially back then, we're Americans, we overdo everything overboard. So they said, well, we're going to have L5s. We're going to have to supply them. So they need some C-47s. We got C-47s. You might as well get some gliders. So they got Waco gliders. So if we're going to have that, we need something to protect them. Let's get some. They actually wanted P-38s, but they ended up with P-31As. And then they said, well, if we're going to have that, we might as well have some bombers. So then they ended up with B-25s, the ones, in fact, that had the cannon in the front, the H models, and a bunch of firepower. So they just kept asking this to Hap Arnold, and he just kept saying, this is a good idea. Let's keep going. So then they kind of got the hang of this, and they said because the weather was so odd, they said, we really don't want like the regular flight jackets. They only have two pockets. They want some like the Commandos use that had a bunch of pockets. And, of course, the Army had a fit about that. Hap Arnold said, too bad, you're going to get them. And then they wanted some canvas boots because it's so wet there instead of normal leather boots. They were a Marine Corps issue. They weren't happy about the Marine Corps giving that up, but they had to give that up. So they finally got going on this whole thing with the first Air Commandos. And it was also called Project 9. Like everything in the military, it changed names. It was like Project CW2-947, but it ended up as Project 9. So they got going with this project, and then they kind of thought, well, hell, this might actually work. So they ended up, and the gentleman they got that probably would be called today the maintenance officer, the engineering officer, was someone folks may have heard of, Dick Cole. Dick Cole came in to run the transport department and the maintenance. And, of course, Dick was Jimmy Doolittle's co-pilot. We were up CF. Was a big friend of the CAF. And they also got some other different folks. One was an all-star first baseman for the Washington Senators who almost got court-martialed because when he was leaving, he took a fighter and flew it over the stadium during a game. Fortunately, no one got the N number, or the serial number, so he did not get court-martialed. So they took that away, and they got that fixed. Another was Jackie Coogan, who was a child star, but most of us may know him as Uncle Fester. He was also one of their pilots. So they had a very odd group of folks, and they started taking delivery, and they even took delivery. And later on, I'll show you a picture of one of the first helicopters. They had found out about those, and Hap Arnold kind of got into I'm sick of these weapon systems we develop and use them the next war. So they ended up, and we'll talk about that a little bit because that involved L5s also. But that's how they got the first Air Commandos going, and they really helped these Chindits, who are a mixture of Burmese troops and Indian troops. They would go back, disrupt, and do all those things that needed to be done. They also had, I'm looking at my list here, they did operate a few P-47s for a while, and later on they operated some C-46s. But that was near the very end of the war. This was in 1943, so this is not a beginning of the war concept they got going. So they got all that going, and they had a lot of the L5s. The important part of that was they ended up adding, they call them bomb racks, but they were racks so they could drop medicine and ammo and things like that to these troops whose job was to go out in the field and disrupt. It was not like a big army, we're going to push you out of Berlin or something. They would go out and disrupt the troops. And the C-47s just weren't as accurate as an L-5 in order to fly right over and drop all these supplies. So they would drop these supplies to those folks while they're out there. So it ended up being, they did a lot of first, and they were some of the first ever to invade enemy territory only by air. So when they say that, it was almost all the gliders they had. They also were the first ever to use air-to-ground rockets. They were pioneered by the P-51As actually in combat. So they did that. They did they were some of the first to do night glider insertions and retrievals, as they would set up the gliders that did not get torn up. They'd put up things almost like they do with banner tows, and the C-47 will pick them back up and relaunch them and bring them back. That was kind of a new concept. That worked. That part worked. The problem was the gliders being in good shape after they landed was not good. One of the examples is they had a field they were going to land gliders in, and they went out to the field, and when they ended up dropping the gliders, there was a bunch of logs, teak logs, all over the field. Well, they were afraid the Japanese had discovered them, but they decided to go ahead and land anyway. Well, first of all, it ended up being some folks who were loggers who had put them out there because it's easier for them to get them out. But it did tear up a bunch of the gliders on landing. And, of course, with all glider operations, somebody gets hurt. So they immediately were able to move the logs, and the L5s going and pick up the injured folks. Also, until later, they had no L5s that were equipped as stretcher bearers. So they modified them to do that. Now, the ones built by Stinson ended up being better. I mean, they were designed by the company, not just cut open and put in there. But they figured out how to do that and get that going. So there's a lot of books about it. The whole first Air Commando unit is just, it's very strange. They had, like for mess, they had at their main base, they just had a mess hall. They didn't have an officer's mess. And the general came in and said he didn't like that, and he thought they should have an officer's mess. And they said they'd be happy to serve him outside. And he said, okay. So he had his meal outside and ate fine. They also had an incident where someone didn't like that the folks were not very shaved. And one of the weirdest memos ever issued by an Army Air Corps commander was basically, if it does not interfere with anything you're doing, please try to take a shave. But if it does, we're not going to slow down operations because of, and they were almost like you would see on the TV show MASH. They were kind of irreverent and just a group that, as long as they got the job done, Hap Arnold was happy.
Pretty fascinating part of the L5 story, and I didn't know much about it until today.
Well, it is. The whole thing, the whole Air Commandos is fascinating because it operated, General Arnold protected them, because what he didn't want to happen was supplies be bled off. And we all understand why somebody would want to do that. If they said, this mission really need 30 C-47s, and we know those guys have whatever number, I forget they had, I think it's about 30, that maybe we can use some of theirs. Well, the problem is they end up never going back. So Hap Arnold wanted this to work and keep, they absolutely did not want the Japanese to make any inroads into India, which was also some political issues with that. But another interesting thing was this was all about defeating the Japanese, because as we know, mainland China ended up as a communist country. The part that was Burma then, now it was a dictatorship. And India, while a democracy, it's just a different democracy than we're used to. So this was all about basically defeating the Japanese, who, as we all know, they were equal opportunity horrible to all their captives and anyone else they happened to take over. So it didn't matter if you were Asian, Caucasian, any African American, as we call them, any of those, they didn't care. They were horrible to you. So that was, I don't know if that's good news or bad news, but there was no racial discretion among them. If you weren't Japanese, you were the bad guy. Then some of the other things that happened is, and this was Uncle Fester did this. When the airplanes would land, they had to get back to the start of the field. And in order to do that, a truck had to come and tow them over there. Well, the indigenous folks were using elephants as heavy lifters and all that. So he said, well, I got a deal. Let's hook the elephant up and let it tow the airplane over so I don't have to wait for the truck. Well, they got the harness on the elephant and they got all that done and they hooked it up to the airplane. But the elephants were mostly trained for lifting and pushing, not for pulling. So once they got going, the elephant perceived that his airplane was following it and kept going faster and faster. And of course, the handler could not control it, and it finally stopped as it ran through the woods and tore the wings off the airplane. So that was one of the odd things that happened. They just had a lot of, the other was that when Cochrane was in command, they had R.T. Smith, who was also an AVG pilot, was flying a Mustang, and he got Lord Mountbatten, who was in charge of the whole area, just wanted to give him a little speech. He got up on a Jeep, and Cochrane didn't know, and hardly anybody did. All that stuff was secret that Mountbatten was coming. So he came zooming in and flew so close over Mountbatten's head that it jerked the hat off. And once he landed, of course, he got called to Cochrane's office, who knew all the good swear words, and started talking bad to him and said, you know how bad it would have been for us if you had cut the head off the Supreme Commander? And his excuse was, well, I wouldn't have done that to Mountbatten. He goes, I thought it was you giving a speech. Well, that didn't go over real big either. So that's just another one of the odd things that happened in that kind of situation. And if anybody wanted to know at the beginning, they operated 12 L1s, 100 L5s, 30 P-51As. They had 12 Nordine Norsemen, which were called UC-64s. It's a Nordine kind of version of a de Havilland Beaver. It was just something that had something between the C-47s and the L-5s. They operated 100 of the Waco gliders, just the normal troop gliders that we operated. They also operated 25 TG-5. They're Aranca training gliders. This was basically the only place they used them in combat in case they had to get into a real short field with just a real few folks. So they would do that, and they sent them 6 of the YR-4 Sikorsky helicopters. Now, 2 of them didn't make it. They got torn up, and that was not while they were in flight. That was in the shipping crates and stuff. That's how delicate these were. So the R4, which is a YR, which means it's still experimental, they had sent it over rapidly, the first one, from where they were testing it. They put it in an airplane, it went to LaGuardia and flew right there. They took it out, put it together. Well, by then, the folks that needed rescuing had already been brought out by troops. So they also operated the first ever helicopter combat rescue. So they had another gentleman who was in a weather station on top of a mountain. I think it was 3,900 feet. And he had gotten injured. And the injury is odd because he had been somehow in combat but shot himself in the hand. So it was an accidental self-inflicted wound. So in order to go get him, though, the helicopter, they put 2 helicopter pilots in it. They took off. 2 L5s went with them. They had no radios, no any of that in the helicopter. So the L5s are navigation. The helicopter only traveled around 60 miles an hour, which is too fast, too slow, even for the L5s. They would circle around. They lost sight of them a couple of times, and they would use mirrors to flash at them so they could find them. So, and they had those bomb racks on the wing. So they had somehow rigged those to drop fuel. So the first couple of stops, they landed at airfields. Then the next stop was an opening they'd cut, and they dropped them fuel. They fueled up, and they also let one of the pilots out because they didn't have enough lift to pick up, because this was really early helicopter technology. So when they first went up, they had some problems because of the turbulence. They finally got up to this weather station where they had cleared just a helipad. The turbulence was horrible. It was too hot, so they waited until the next day. Well, in the meantime, the L5s had dropped fuel to them, but they have no radios. They had to take pieces of paper they found and write out on the ground oil. They needed oil. So the L5s went back and parachuted in some oil to them. So they got that, and they were able to move this gentleman out. Once they got him to a regular airfield, they put him in an L5 and evacuated him. But that was the first successful helicopter rescue. So that was kind of a big deal. And the L-5s, they couldn't have done it without the L-5s. They had to have something to navigate for them, to drop them fuel and all those things. So that's kind of an interesting also ran story of the L-5s. Their main mission was evacuating wounded, and that made the morale at the units much, much better, because once they knew that you're not just going to have a gun in a tree to sit by, and that's your only hope, that the L-5s would come and get you. They also were used for spotting the bad guys, of course, just artillery, and they're slow. And one time, two of the P-51 pilots were flying in, and they got to talking about, one of them said, it's that L-5 guys, that's a terrible thing. They could get shot down, all kinds of things should happen. And his wingman said, I don't think so. I think they can't. So what they decided to do is they took an L-5 up with the one P-51 pilot flying it, and the other Mustang pilot went up and did his best, just using the gun camera, to try to get him in his sights. And he could not get the L-5 in the sights of the Mustang to shoot it down. Now, there's a lot of assumptions there. One is he knew the bad guy was coming, which makes a difference. And the Japanese also had some airplanes that were quite a bit more maneuverable at low speeds and low altitudes than a Mustang. But it did raise the morale quite a bit of the L-5 pilots to know at least they had a chance. If they just kept making tight turns and turning around and things like that, you could run the bad guy out of fuel maybe before he actually could shoot you down. So that's just another thing that I don't think in a normal air base you could do. But because you're in the middle of nowhere in Burma, and the war would stop almost for both sides for 6 months because of the monsoon season. The weather was too bad for airplanes. The fighters never really developed as a problem. The B-25s, most of those guys said most of their missions were ground attack, and they never experienced seeing an airplane that was an enemy. So they got going that. So then they came up, and I think we have a picture of the P-51s with an idea. They put stripes on the airplanes. Well, part of that had to do with the 5 different divisions. It was bombers, fighters, transport, gliders, and liaison. But the real thing was the gentleman who was in charge of all the fighters, he didn't want them shooting each other down. So it was kind of a precursor of D-Day invasion stripes, so all the good guys could tell. Now, on the L-5, they're more symbolic. They're very small, and they're just on the vertical fin. But that's more so they're part of the group. The helicopter did not have any. But that's part of the stripes. You'll see there's an air museum that has a C-47 restored in that paint scheme. There's a couple of P-47s, and I meant C-47s as I said P, but there's some C-47s and some Thunderbolts that are restored with that scheme on it. And it is kind of nice. They just use what they had, white paint, and he has some yellow paint you can see in this picture. A lot of them have the names of whatever, be it the sweetheart or a movie star or mama or whatever on the airplane. So, but these airplanes were perfect for them because the A models, they really kind of ran out of a mission for them. They were the perfect airplane for this mission. They were low altitude, mostly strafing and things of that nature. So that's the main thing about this, and that's the whole deal with the stripes, because people ask about that all the time. They also ask when I showed our group the ones on the vertical stabilizer. And I said, this is a symbolic thing, so they're all kind of brothers in the whole deal. So, and all the B-25 pilots for the Air Commandos he only had fighter pilots fly the airplane. You can see on this profile, of the L-5, the 5 stripes on the vertical stabilizer. They're not real exciting paint schemes, but they're important. The L-birds were super important, all of them, in the operation. The L-5s also, they developed, and I think you can go online and find maybe a video of it, training video. They would have the guy in the back lower a wire down with kind of an odd-looking little hooky thing, and it would pick up a message and bring it back up. For instance, if you were in the field, they could actually pick up mail and pick it up. It was an odd system because it was designed so, and it had to be basically held by the guy, because if it caught something heavy, you didn't want it to pull the airplane out of the sky so it could go away. But it's just another thing. They also used these airplanes, and they tried putting a 60-millimeter rocket on it. Well, they found out, first of all, there was just a lot of problems with that. There's a picture of the rocket tubes they tried. First, they were a little bit draggy. Second of all, no one was really trained. You just kind of had to point the airplane down there, and it seemed like it was more for the enjoyment of the pilot than it was doing any damage. So the powers that be kind of put the kibosh on that, but it was fun to let them try. And they did end up later using phosphorus rockets over target marking. Most of the time they would use it, just mark it on a map, but with the phosphorus, with the B-25s or the P-51s, which, as we talked about, had air-to-ground rockets on it, they could mark it with the phosphorus smoke and do it. So these airplanes, they tried a lot of stuff with them. They did a lot of mods in the Pacific. They went on and off carriers. They had a weird system in the Pacific where it was like playing tetherball, where it started slinging around a pole and then it kind of let go and flew, and that kind of worked, but it looked like it was pretty scary. So they did that, but it did a lot of things, and there were a lot of personal transports. And if you don't think they got shot down, they did. They sent General Patton in Africa wanted some L-5s, and they came over. Well, no one told the anti-aircraft gunners. They shot all of them down but one. So, I mean, it still was a very dangerous mission and a very, very important mission, especially if you're being evacuated and you're injured. So those were very, very important things that these airplanes did. They're just all fascinating. This whole group is fascinating. Also, one of the rescues they made was a C-47 landed at kind of a big opening where some gliders had landed, because it's always better to snatch the gliders off the ground from the ground. And the C-47 hit a water buffalo. Well, that tore up the C-47. Somebody got injured. I'm sure it didn't do the water buffalo well either. But they sent an L-5 in for the rescue of the pilot, not the water buffalo, and they were able to save him out. But all kinds of odd things like that. There's just, especially with this airplane that has some lift, unlike perhaps an L-4, the Cub Grasshopper, which had its own wonderful story, but this one could take people in and out that were injured. So it's very important. They also ended up in something called Operation Thursday, which started in March 1944. It was the first big operation performed by the 1st Air Commandos. Their whole deal was to infiltrate, and they were going to come in behind to kind of cut up the flanks of the Japanese, who by then were more holding ground than they were attacking. So the whole idea was just make them use up more ammo, make the soldiers move around more, as they didn't have a lot of food, although there people were eating snakes and water buffaloes or whatever. So, but they didn't really have a resupply, so they could help them. They used that up and then for a final push. And Burma, they never really completely took over Burma. The Japanese more retreated at the end of the war because they couldn't hold their home islands, and they sure didn't really worry as much. They digressed near the coast, and then, of course, after the bomb hit, the Russians attacked before the second bomb. But then they operated Operation Capital, which was another operation behind lines. That was almost all Indian troops. And that was another thing. The British government really wanted to support the Indian troops. So all the aircraft, and that's when they ended up with some P-47s and also some C-46s, which could carry more troops, and send them back behind lines and support them. But like I said, all those ground troops will tell you that the L-5 was the most important airplane they had, because it would evacuate you if you were wounded. And nothing will make you feel better than knowing if something bad happens, you can get out. So they all loved that. And they were all non-commissioned officers flying the L-5s, which is another story. I don't know if that was whole worldwide, but I know it was in Burma. And those guys, the staff sergeants, did an absolutely marvelous job.
But again, the star of the show was the L-5. And maybe we can just transition a little bit into the FloriBama's L-5 and the reason that we're raising some money tonight.
Well, yeah, we can do that. The FloriBama L-5. Well, let me talk about this first, just quickly. Why we chose this. Okay. We're raising money for aesthetics and redo the paint on the airplane. If we have any extra money, we're going to redo the interior. But the reason we have picked this is the Air Force Special Operations Command is at Hurlbut Field, which is Fort Walton Beach, and we're in Milton, Florida, which is between Fort Walton and Pensacola, where the airplane is. But we have a lot of connections with that group. In fact, one of our very active members, he also has his own grass strip airport, and he worked with what they call AFSOC, and he was a major general, a 2-star general. And also, one of his jobs was, which he volunteered for, he was an Air Force historian. So he knows a lot about all this stuff, and he's given a lot of his time and effort and lets us use his airport when we'd like to. And he has a collection of different L-birds that he's very interested in. But the AFSOC, their motto is any place, anytime, anywhere. That was the motto of the original first Air Commandos. In fact, there's a great book I got a lot of facts out of, and that's the name of the book also. So they operate at this time, they operate AC-130s, which are the gunships, a couple of models of those, MC-130s, which are electronic, I think they call them combat talons. I don't know exactly all they do, but they're combat electronics at headquarters kind of things. They operate C-145s, which is a Polish-built twin-engine turboprop by PZL. It's a very odd-looking airplane, but they use those. And they also operate C-146s, which are basically Dornier 328 commuter airliners. They operate the turboprop version, not the jet version, as they have both. They operate those, and they also are one of the very few Air Force units that operate the Ospreys. And from where I live, I can sit around and you can tell an Osprey. It doesn't sound like an airplane or a helicopter. So it has, they also operate some helicopters kind of in conjunction with other services. They have some CH-53Es and some other helicopters, because those guys are, I think, if you take away real small specialized units, they're usually away from home over 250 days a year. So they have the base is beautiful there. They love their heritage. And that's why we chose to honor those guys. And they're very helping with us. And the CBI Theater is just not that well known. So we want to do that. So that's why we have chosen those folks. So our airplane going to be called the Ramblin Rebel. And it was operated by Staff Sergeant Richard Snyder. Richard Snyder is the one who came up with the whole how to mount the phosphorus rockets on the airplane and kept doing it. He also helped them. He was really good at the spotter version too. Now he saved more people. So this is his airplane, although they were always used by other people. So they called it the Ramblin Rebel because he was not real big on following the exact protocol of the armed forces. So he was perfect for the first Air Commando. He was very good at his job and never slept off on that, but some of the other things. And as you can see in this picture, he's got a non-standard hat on, which some of them used. And you can see the Ramblin Rebel. The Ramblin Rebel, what they did on that was they named it after him. And we have a artist who's forensically redoing this picture of the young lady on the front. That was taken out of an Esquire magazine and laminated on the airplane. They had a tendency to do that on the L-5s because all the other airplanes had real honest-to-God nose art. And like they wanted their 5 stripes, they wanted some nose art. But this is one of the better ones. It's also everything's covered that should be, so we don't have any issues with that with any interaction with our cadets or children. So that is one of the main things that we want to do. Now, Steve has some pictures of why we want to repaint the airplane. So there's 2 or 3. You can see the paint has had, well, when we got the airplane, it was in fine mechanical shape. And also we've had to replace and repair some of the fuel tanks, which involve cutting the top of the wing and installing new tanks or new parts. So that also needs to be redone. John's 360s, the late John Mosley and his son now runs a place that have been very good to the CAF. They will end up doing the work for us, and it will be beautiful. Now, all the things they've done, they've painted Gunfighter, and if you guys have seen that, they've done a great job on that. So once we get this airplane, get some money raised, we want to do that. The AFSOC Society, which is a non-government entity, but it's kind of the legacy of all those guys who were also in Korea, and this whole legacy went on for quite a while. They've flown A-26 Douglas Invaders, which became B-26s, whatever, in Korea, and they've operated some helicopters. They've operated all kinds of C-130s. So our airplane right now is painted as an OY-1, and it's a post-war, and we're not really sure. It's kind of a generic paint scheme. So we're going to do something so we know what we're honoring, and we know we have the support of the community there. And there's plenty of airplanes, despite us being so close, who are painted to honor the U.S. Navy aviators. So we thought this is something that's in our area, a small, even for that, there's only, I think, 3,600 people assigned to AFSOC, which sounds like a lot, but it's really not when you look at normal, because we're also close to Eglin Air Force Base. In fact, I live 2 miles from there. It's gigantic. There's always something happening in Eglin. It's always exciting looking out across the bay to see what's flying. But we thought the Hobart community who will help us, and they give lectures to the public a couple of times a year just on their history, which most of it involves the first Air Commandos. So I want to mention I am not an expert on any of this, so most of my information will not be wrong, but I may not have given enough information on it. So I'm sure in the comments you can correct that. Please just start it off with a nice comment, not, boy, you're stupid, because I already know all this. We can just get the comments, and that will help me if you guys come up with that. So anything you do to help us, I really do appreciate. And Steve, once again, I've had a great time.
Yeah. What was the title of that book that you'd referenced earlier about the Air Commandos?
The book is Any Place, Anywhere, Anytime.
Good. Okay. Available at your local bookseller, right?
I bought mine from, like I said, we had Clay McCutcheon, who's a retired 2-star general, and he provided me a lot of stuff. A lot of it, though, did not concern the L-5. It was fascinating. But that was one of the books he had. It's kind of a small publishing company. I had to get mine off of Amazon. I could not find it anywhere else. But it's a fascinating book about the whole, and it has some very one-off pictures. The first Air Commandos, just the whole story is fantastic, not just the L5 part. So I recommend anyone. There's also a book which I've ordered but not received called Project 9, and the gentleman who wrote it had the help of Dick Cole before he passed away. So I would recommend that book, even though I haven't read it. I still recommend it.
Yeah. If Dick Cole was involved, it's probably a good read.
Exactly. There's a good small seminar with the gentleman who wrote the book Project 9, and Dick Cole and his daughter was in attendance at that. This picture you have up, which is our L5 now, we've still never figured out if it's nasty break 5 or that's just supposed to be a point where the break is. So, but this is one of our members who has a lot of ground vehicles and a couple of historic L-birds, and he is also a reenactor. So this is the field, also the private field I had mentioned that we bring in, and it's very good. We have some of the Taylor crafts, the L4s, the L5s, the L3s. They also have, and I forget the actual designation, but the air coupe. This is it right here. You notice all these are different airplanes. And he also has an air coupe, which while they only tested 2 of them, they did test 2 of them. And it also was the first airplane he ever tried JADO on, was of all things an air coupe. I guess he figured it was no big loss if it blew up. I don't know.
You mentioned the air coupe, and that will actually be our featured aircraft next week. The Great Plains Wing has one of the air coupes that was used in JADO testing, so we'll find out more about that next week.
I'm fascinated by that. The Great Plains Wing will do a good job. So you guys, besides donating to our airplane, donate some to the Great Plains Wing, because they've assisted for years and years operating Gunfighter, and they're going to do their own airplane, and that will be great. But anybody who wants to, you can always go in online and find on the CF site. We're happy to have anybody come visit. Like I said, in the winter, not so much, but in the summer, we operate a lot out of this grass field. This is actually Milton, Florida, where the airplane is based. Here's the grass field with all our members out there. And that yellow wing in the background is the air coupe. You can't really see it, but that's pretty much almost all our members that are active. Like all units we have, and I'm sure Steve is the same. I'm a member of 13 units. Well, obviously, I don't get to them that often, but I do like to keep up and support them. So a lot of people do ask me that, too. I help with new units when they start, and they go, well, I'm already a member of the B-29 unit. Can I join the Birmingham unit? Yes, you can. They're all happy to have you. So just a little plug there for the new units. especially they're all doing well, and they would love to have you join them or just come visit them sometime. Remember, all the units love having visitors, and you guys know that. At your unit, you may love having visitors. So come visit wherever. Yes, those are some of our cadets. We have a cadet program. Okay. In fact, the person taking the picture was also a cadet. I wish he was in the picture. But and we're very thankful to have them. We support the people at Hurlburt come out to the field, and we do different events for them, including they have a group out there of British and New Zealanders who operate on the computer systems for the F-35. And we have them out, and for some reason they have a very odd, fun tradition of setting a piano on fire. So once a year we have them for a Battle of Britain Memorial, and they set a piano on fire. So there's always something happening in the CAF.
That's one of the more unusual traditions I've heard of.
Yes.
When the airplane is airworthy and flying, is it part of the rides program?
It is part of the rides program. We're an interesting fact, when we took it to our very first event, once we got okayed on the rides program, we went to a place called Evergreen, Alabama. It's where they make Connecta sausage, and it was the Connecta Sausage Festival. So the wing leader and myself were concerned no one was going to buy a ride, and we said, well, we may have to pick somebody and just pay for them to have a ride. We sold 9 rides that day, and all but one of them had never, ever flown in an airplane. So it was just fascinating. And 2 or 3 of them were very trepidatious to get in the airplane. And when they came back, they had the windows open and arms out and woo-hoo. And so that gave us a lot of satisfaction with that particular event.
Excellent. What are some of the other events that you have planned for the coming year? Well,
in one of the things we do in February is we have a Mardi Gras float. So we go up and down the Mardi Gras parade and throw beads and just let ourselves be known in the Milton community. Oddly enough, the gentleman who announces it also announces that Sun and Fun. So he knows airplanes, and he's very, plus the most dangerous thing about the Mardi Gras parade is we're required to have a walker on each side of the float, just in case kids get through and they can't get under the tire. Well, unfortunately, some of our people on the float aren't that good, and our walkers seem to get beamed with beads quite often. So the beads are kind of dangerous to our own folks. But other than that, that's a big success. I mean, that's not a money raiser, but we do that. We also do a thing with the Battleship Alabama does it 4 times a year. But we will fly some of the L-birds, including our L-5 if the weather's good. They open part of the parking lot as an FAA-approved runway, and we will fly in to the air part in the Battleship Alabama and participate in their kind of living history reenactment things. And that's also, we get some rides out of that. We can't sell them from that venue, but we do get rides out of that. And we always have the usual holiday party. We have a 4th of July party. One of the local restaurants really supports us for our kind of 4th of July event. Last time they brought out, I think, 250 chicken wings and served them for us. So that was a big success. We did that on Clay's Field, which also was nice. So we have events. We also do things, we do our best to sell different things and T-shirts and coins like most units to make money. And we're getting close to, of course, COVID set us back. Fortunately, we had some members able to basically pay the bills while that was happening. But I think next year in 2024 will be our first year we'll be self-sufficient. So we won't have to have kick-ins. We always, and the folks will still give us money, but they'd much rather be used for other things than just keeping the place afloat. So, and I know all smaller units have this problem, but those are the main events. Of course, we always make events and go to. We have members with T6s, member with a beautiful T-34, and they always support us because our wing leader actually has a beautiful T-34, and he brings that to every event so people can visit and do that. And we support the guys with the helicopter up in Hammond, and they're very supportive of us, as is the Big Easy Wing and the folks in Mississippi. The proximity to us, all the small wings, we seem to work together and try to make it so nobody goes under. So it's all fascinating. I would recommend anybody come to one of those events, see the L-bird, see the helicopter, see all those things. Going to a small event or air show is just as much fun as a big air show. It's just a different kind of fun.
Exactly. And here's your opportunity to support the L-5 from the FloriBama Wing. Just go to the Commemorative Air Force webpage. Right on the homepage, you'll see this image. Click on it, and you'll learn more about the L-5 and all the airplanes that are in the 12 Planes of Christmas. And we please encourage you to give where you can. And if you find some favorite airplanes, maybe more than one, go ahead and support them. Every donation helps. There's also the Restoration Grant Fund, which helps get money back into the field. It's a grant program that units apply for to restore their aircraft. So it's your donation can help not only the L-5 but maybe some of the other aircraft that are in the CAF inventory. Rick, any final thoughts before we wrap up tonight?
Well, one thing, and I can't remember if I mentioned it, you may see some slides of Bill Caniff, who is a publisher of a comic book, and the Cochrane, the squadron leader who helped start the first Air Commando, one of the characters in there is modeled directly after him. There's Harry and the pilots, and that's Bill Caniff is who wrote it, and I forget the exact name, but the gentleman that is the pilot was Flip Corkin. So he was not only a comic book hero and an ace, he also, when he was young, dated Betty White. So which is another odd fact. So I just wanted you guys to know that. That's just trivia that has really nothing to do with L5s, but it's just very interesting to me.
It certainly is. It's been an hour of interesting anecdotes tonight, Rick. So we talked not only about the L5, but also about the first Air Commandos. It's really quite a fascinating story, and again, one that I think I'm going to delve into, and I hope other folks listening to you tonight, it's whet their appetite for finding out more about the Air Commandos themselves. So thank you for sharing that and for sharing information on the L-5. And again, if you can support that airplane, please do so.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
All right. Thank you, Rick. And as always, thank you for joining us at Warbird Tube. If you have any suggestions for future topics, feedback on any of our shows, just send Leah Block an email at media@cafhq.org. Again, thanks to Rick Bell for being with us tonight, and to you for joining us this holiday season. Till next time, I'm Steve Buss. This is CAF Warbird Tube. Good night.